Get out of my cockpit!
I was assigned to this flight, Captain.
Not with her. I don't fly with your kind.
I have every right to be here.
Rights? A monkey in a uniform still doesn't fly planes. Sweetheart, go fetch coffee. That's more your speed.
11 crew members. Not one word. Not one spine. Whitney Carter stood still. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes burned. But she didn't move.
I'm not going anywhere.
We'll see about that.
He pulled out his phone, called management, voice loud enough for every soul in that room to hear.
Get this woman off my flight. Now.
He was so sure they'd fix this. So sure the world still worked the way he wanted. He had no idea what was about to happen. Man, what happened next on that flight? Nobody, and I mean nobody, saw this coming. Not the passengers, not the crew, absolutely no one. The cockpit of a Boeing 737 is 8 feet wide. That morning, it felt like 4. Grant settled into the left seat without a word. He adjusted his headset, ran his fingers across the overhead panel, and began the pre-flight checklist the way he always did. Alone. As if the right seat were empty. As if it had always been empty. Whitney buckled in. She placed her hands on her knees, waited 3 seconds, then spoke. "Ready for the checklist when you are, Captain." Grant didn't respond. He reached for the fuel quantity gauge, read it to himself, and moved on. He tested the fire warning panel, checked the hydraulic pressure indicators. Every action precise, deliberate, and pointedly singular. The checklist was designed for 2 voices. Captain calls, Copilot confirms. That was the architecture of cockpit safety. Redundancy through communication. Grant flew it like a solo act. Whitney watched him skip 3 items that required her verbal response. She didn't remind him. She simply noted the time in her leather notebook. 6:42. CRM non-compliance. Pre-flight checklist items 7, 11, 14 omitted. When the cabin crew came up for the briefing, Grant turned to them, not to Whitney. He addressed the lead flight attendant, a woman named Lisa Harmon, with the full warmth he'd denied his co-pilot. "Standard run, Lisa. Smooth air all the way. We'll have you on the ground before your coffee gets cold." He smiled. Charming. Effortless. The kind of smile that made people forget he'd just frozen a woman out of her own cockpit. Lisa glanced at Whitney. A quick look. Half curiosity, half sympathy. Whitney caught it and gave the smallest nod. Not a plea, an acknowledgement. They pushed back at 0702. Grant handled the radio calls to ground control himself. Standard procedure gave the co-pilot communication duties during taxi. Grant took those too. Whitney keyed her mic once. Ground, Skyvance 4012, runway 27 right, holding short. Grant reached over and switched the radio to his side. He retransmitted the same call, word for word, as if hers hadn't happened. The ground controller paused, confused by the duplicate, then acknowledged Grant's version. Whitney's face didn't change, but her pen moved again. 6:58, radio override during taxi. Deliberate. The takeoff was textbook. Grant's hands were good. Whatever poison ran through his character, it hadn't reached his stick and rudder skills. The 737 lifted off runway 27 right and climbed into a Georgia morning that looked like it had been painted. Amber light cutting through thin clouds, the city falling away beneath them like a dropped photograph. At cruise altitude, Grant finally spoke to her. Sort of. "Coffee. Black. No sugar." Whitney looked at him. "I'm sorry? You're closer to the galley." He didn't look up from the flight management system. "Figured you could grab one on your way." The request wasn't about coffee. It was about position. About making sure she understood the hierarchy he'd built inside his head. a hierarchy that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the picture he'd decided she fit into the moment she walked through that briefing room door. Whitney unclipped her harness. She walked to the galley. She brought back the coffee, black, no sugar. She set it in the cup holder without a word and returned to her seat. Grant sipped it. He didn't say thank you. 40 minutes into the flight, Lisa came to the cockpit door to check on service timing. Grant leaned back, voice low, but not low enough. You know, Lisa, I've been flying since before some of these new hires were born. There was a time when you had to earn this seat. Thousands of hours. Military time. Not some, he waved his hand vaguely, fast-track program. Lisa's smile tightened. She'd heard this speech before, or versions of it, in break rooms, at hotel bars, in the slow hours of red-eye flights, when pilots said what they really thought because they believed the darkness gave them cover. She seems competent, Captain, Lisa offered carefully. Grant snorted. Competent. He said it the way you'd say adequate about a meal you didn't order. Give it 2 months. Diversity hire. You'll see. He said it loud enough that Whitney, sitting 4 feet away with her headset half off, heard every syllable. She wrote nothing this time. She didn't need to. Some things you remember without ink. The landing in Charlotte was Grant's. Smooth, centered, the kind of touchdown that made passengers applaud if they noticed, which they usually didn't. He ran the shutdown checklist alone again. Post-flight paperwork, alone. He signed the logbook and handed it to maintenance without letting Whitney review it. At the gate, as passengers filed off, Whitney stood in the jet bridge. Lisa passed her with a food cart and stopped. Hey, for what it's worth, I thought you handled that really well. Whitney looked at her. Something passed across her face. Not gratitude, not anger. Something that lived in the space between patience and planning. Thank you, Lisa, she said. I appreciate you saying that. Lisa nodded and moved on, wondering why a brand new Copilot carried a Mont Blanc pen and spoke like someone who'd already decided how this story was going to end. 3 more flights over the next 5 days. Atlanta to Charlotte. Charlotte to Jacksonville. Jacksonville back to Atlanta. The triangle route that Skyvant's crews called the Loop, and for Whitney Carter, it was becoming a cage with wings. The pattern was never dramatic enough to report. That was the genius of it. Grant Wallace didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply erased her.
On the second flight, he forgot to notify Whitney about the pre-departure briefing. She arrived to find the crew already seated, charts reviewed, weather discussed. Grant looked up from his notes with the kind of surprise that takes practice. "Oh, didn't see you there, Carter. We started without you. You know how tight the turnaround is." The crew shifted in their chairs. Nobody corrected him. Nobody said she hadn't been told. Silence, Whitney was learning, was its own form of participation.
By the third flight, Grant had recruited allies. Doug Teller and Pete Simmons. Both senior first officers, both men who'd orbited Grant's gravity for years. Doug was the quiet one. He wouldn't look at Whitney in the crew room, wouldn't acknowledge her greeting, wouldn't hold the door. The kind of cruelty that hides behind the excuse of being busy. Pete was louder. He told jokes at the briefing table that stopped the moment Whitney entered, then resumed in whispers that carried just far enough. The 3 of them formed a wall. Not visible, not provable, but absolute. At the layover hotel in Jacksonville, Whitney sat alone in the restaurant, table for 1 by the window, grilled chicken, sparkling water, flight manual open beside her plate. Through the glass partition, she could see Grant's table, Doug on his left, Pete on his right, 2 other crew members filling out the frame. Laughter, clinking glasses. Grant telling a story with his hands, the way pilots do when they're performing for an audience. One of the crew members glanced toward Whitney. For a moment, their eyes met. The crew member looked away first. Whitney cut her chicken. She didn't rush. She didn't leave early. She ate every bite at the same steady pace, as if the loneliness at her table was a meal she'd ordered on purpose. Back in her hotel room, she made a call. "I've seen enough," she said. The room was dark except for the blue glow of her phone. "But I need one more week. The behavior is systemic. It's not just him. He's got at least 2 others mirroring it. If I pull out now, they'll call it a personality conflict and close the file." The voice on the other end was measured, professional. "Understood, ma'am. The board meeting is on the 15th. Do you want the preliminary report before or after?" "Ma'am. Not Whitney, not hey. Ma'am. The way you address someone who signs the checks." "After," Whitney said. "I want the full picture." She hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Even generals get tired, even the ones who chose the war. The next morning, Grant filed a formal complaint. Whitney saw the notification on the crew management system before she finished her first coffee. 3 pages. Detailed. Captain Grant Wallace, employee ID 7741, formally requesting reassignment of First Officer Whitney Carter on grounds of insufficient cockpit resource management skills and inability to meet communication standards required for safe flight operations. 3 pages of professional language that said in every line she didn't belong. He'd CC'd the chief pilot's office, the training department, and the crew scheduling manager. The kind of distribution list designed not to solve a problem, but to create a paper trail that buries one. Whitney read all 3 pages. Twice. She took a photo of each one with her phone. Not the company phone Skyvance had issued her, but a personal device with an email app whose domain name didn't match any employee system. On the 4th flight, Jacksonville to Atlanta, closing the loop, something small happened that only Lisa noticed. Whitney's phone buzzed during boarding. She glanced at the screen for less than 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, Lisa saw the email preview. She wasn't snooping. She was standing in the galley, 3 feet away, loading meal carts. The email had a logo at the top. Not the standard Skyvance employee portal logo, the blue and silver badge that showed up on crew memos and schedule updates. This was different. Larger. Gold-trimmed. The kind of logo that appeared on quarterly earnings reports and investor letters. The kind of logo that belonged to ownership. Lisa blinked. Whitney locked her phone and slipped it back into her pocket without any change in expression. It could have been nothing. A forwarded newsletter, a phishing email with a fancy header. Lisa told herself it was nothing. But that night, lying awake in her apartment in Atlanta, Lisa Harmon kept seeing that gold-trimmed logo, and she kept hearing Grant Wallace's voice, casual, confident, cruel, saying, "Diversity hire," like it was a diagnosis. Something didn't add up. The pen, the notebook, the calm, that logo. Lisa fell asleep before she could figure out what. But the question followed her into her dreams, and it was still there when she woke. Lisa Harmon had been a flight attendant for 9 years. She'd learned to read cockpits the way farmers read weather, not from instruments, but from the air between people. And something about Whitney Carter didn't read right. Not wrong, just more. It started with the turbulence over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Flight 4078, Charlotte to Atlanta. A Tuesday afternoon that had started clear and turned ugly. The kind of convective chop that rattles overhead bins and sends drink carts sliding. Lisa was bracing herself against the galley wall when the aircraft dropped, hard, and then caught itself with a smoothness that didn't match the violence outside. She'd felt enough turbulence recoveries to know the difference between a pilot fighting the airplane and a pilot talking to it. Whatever Whitney had just done in that cockpit was a conversation. Lisa made her way forward after the seatbelt sign went off. Through the cracked cockpit door, she could see Grant gripping the yoke with white knuckles. His jaw was set, his breathing visible in the rise and fall of his shoulders. Whitney sat beside him, hands relaxed on the center console, breathing slow, pulse point on her neck steady as a clock. She was talking to air traffic control in a voice so calm it sounded like she was ordering lunch. Atlanta Center, Skyvance 4078, requesting flight level 380 to get above the weather. Appreciate the expedite. The controller cleared them immediately. Something in her tone, not urgent, not casual, just precisely authoritative, had moved the request to the front of the line without anyone noticing it had cut. Grant said nothing. He released the yoke and flexed his fingers like they hurt. He didn't acknowledge what Whitney had done. But for the first time in 6 flights, he didn't override her radio call either. That was a crack. Small, but Lisa saw it. The second crack came 3 days later, at the Crew Hotel in Charlotte. Lisa was walking to the vending machine on the 4th floor, 11:30 at night, couldn't sleep, wanted something with bubbles and sugar. The business center was next to the vending alcove, separated by a glass wall. Through it, she saw Whitney. Whitney was sitting at the business center desk, laptop open, reading glasses on, the first time Lisa had ever seen her wear them. The screen glowed with a dashboard that Lisa had never seen on any Skyvance cruise system. It wasn't the scheduling portal. It wasn't the training module. It wasn't the crew communication hub. It had graphs. Revenue graphs, quarterly projections, fleet utilization metrics, route profitability charts with color-coded margins. It looked like the kind of screen that belonged in a boardroom, not a hotel business center at midnight. Whitney must have sensed the movement. She looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. For half a second, something shifted in Whitney's expression. Not panic, not guilt. Recognition. The look of someone who knows they've been seen and is calculating, very quickly, how much that matters. Then she smiled. Warm. Easy. Can't sleep either? Nope, Lisa said. Too much coffee. Story of our lives. Whitney closed the laptop. Not fast, nothing that would suggest hiding, just a smooth, natural movement that happened to put a screen away before anyone could study it. Lisa grabbed her soda and went back to her room. But she didn't drink it. She sat on the bed with the can sweating in her hands and thought about what she'd seen. Revenue dashboards. A Mont Blanc pen. A phone with a gold-trimmed ownership logo. A voice on the radio that made air traffic controllers move faster without being asked. And a Copilot who handled turbulence like someone with 10,000 hours, not the 3,000 her file supposedly showed. Who was Whitney Carter? Lisa didn't have an answer, but she had the shape of one. A silhouette that kept getting clearer every time she looked. The next morning, Lisa found the answer to a question she hadn't asked. She was in the hotel lobby, early, waiting for the crew van. Her phone was open to Skyvance's internal news page, the one with employee spotlights and route announcements. She scrolled past a photo of the company's annual shareholders meeting from 2 years ago. The image showed the usual row of executives at a long table, name placards in front of them. She almost scrolled past it. Almost. In the back row, partially obscured by a standing microphone, was a woman. Tall, composed, dark skin, hair pulled back. The photo was grainy and small, a background figure that no one was supposed to notice. Lisa zoomed in, the pixels blurred. The face was turned slightly away. She couldn't be sure. She couldn't be sure at all. But her hands were shaking when she locked the phone. The crew van arrived. Whitney climbed in last, coffee in hand, leather notebook tucked under her arm. She sat next to Lisa, close enough that Lisa could smell her perfume. Something expensive, something that didn't come from a duty-free carousel. "Morning," Whitney said. "Morning," Lisa said back. Her voice came out higher than she intended. Whitney looked at her for 1 beat longer than normal. Then she opened her notebook and wrote something. The pen moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been writing important things in small books for a very long time. Lisa stared out the window and said nothing. But inside her chest, the question was no longer a question. It was becoming a certainty she didn't know what to do with. Nah, man. This is wild. Imagine showing up to your job, qualified, prepared, completely ready to do what you were hired for. And then some dude looks at you and says, "Hey, go fetch me a coffee." Not because you're new, not because you're unqualified, because of your skin color. In front of everyone. And the craziest part? Nobody says a word. Seriously, what would you do? Because what happened next, nobody saw coming. Nobody. Skyvance Flight 4023. Atlanta to Denver. 172 passengers, 6 crew. Scheduled flight time, 3 hours, 14 minutes. It would become the longest 3 hours of Grant Wallace's career. The morning started routine. Clear skies over Georgia. Smooth climb to cruise altitude. Grant ran the cockpit his usual way. Commands spoken to the air. Checklist items called and answered by himself. Whitney existing in the right seat like furniture he hadn't ordered. At 35,000 feet, somewhere over eastern Tennessee, the first warning light appeared. It was amber. Hydraulic system A. Pressure dropping. Not a catastrophic number, but trending in the wrong direction. The kind of light that most pilots would note, monitor, and address per procedure. Grant noticed it. He tapped the gauge. The needle held its position, low but stable. Probably a sensor glitch, he said. The first full sentence he'd spoken to Whitney in 40 minutes. I've seen this 100 times on the 7-3. Whitney looked at the gauge. She didn't tap it. She read the number, cross-referenced it mentally with the System B pressure, and checked the standby hydraulic quantity indicator. Her eyes moved between 3 instruments in 2 seconds, the kind of scan pattern that took years to build. System A is showing 4,100 psi, she said quietly. Normal is 3,000. We should run the hydraulic abnormal checklist. I said it's a glitch. Grant's voice had an edge. The edge of a man who'd been in charge for 22 years and wasn't about to take diagnostic advice from the person he'd been trying to remove from his cockpit for 2 weeks. 12 minutes later, the light went red. System A, pressure dropped below the threshold. The master caution horn sounded, 2 sharp pulses that cut through the cockpit like a blade. Simultaneously, the flight controls stiffened. Not locked, not yet. But the yoke in Grant's hands suddenly felt heavier, like the airplane had gained 1,000 pounds in the time it took to blink. System A failure, Whitney announced. Her voice was flat, controlled, a frequency that belonged in air traffic control towers and surgical theaters. Running the checklist. She had the quick reference handbook open before Grant could respond. Her fingers found the correct page without searching. Hydraulic System A. Loss of pressure. Step 1. Confirm System A pump switches off. Step 2. Check System B pressure and quantity. Step 3. Assess flight control availability. Grant's hands were on the yoke. Both of them. Squeezing. His knuckles had gone white again, the same white Lisa had seen during the turbulence over the Blue Ridge. But this was different. Turbulence passed. System failures stayed. I've got the aircraft, Grant said. His voice was thinner now. The authority was still there, but it was stretched, like fabric pulled too tight. You have the aircraft, Whitney confirmed. I'll work the problem. She keyed the radio. Denver Center, Skyvance 4023, declaring an emergency. We have a hydraulic system failure, requesting priority handling and vectors for Denver International. The controller's response was immediate. Skyvance 4023, Roger, emergency acknowledged. Turn right, heading 270, descend and maintain flight level 240. Denver, runway 34 left will be available. Emergency equipment standing by. Grant heard the words, emergency equipment, and his breathing changed. Faster, shallower. The kind of breathing that preceded bad decisions. We can make it to Denver on schedule, he said. System B is holding. We don't need to divert. We're already going to Denver. Captain, we need to descend now. Whitney's voice hadn't changed pitch. Not once. System B is holding at nominal, but if we lose redundancy at this altitude, our control authority degrades significantly. The checklist calls for descent to a lower altitude and preparation for manual reversion. I know what the checklist calls for. Grant's jaw locked. I've been flying this aircraft since before you had your license. Then you know we descend. The sentence landed in the cockpit like a stone in still water. No anger, no challenge, just the clean, irrefutable weight of someone who knew the answer and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Grant stared at the instruments. The System B pressure gauge stared back, steady, but alone. The single thread holding 172 lives at 35,000 feet. He descended. The next 20 minutes were the quietest of the flight. Whitney coordinated with Denver Approach Control, calculated fuel requirements, briefed the cabin crew through Lisa, who relayed the message with a voice that was calm on the surface and terrified underneath. Passengers were told to expect a precautionary landing, the word precautionary doing heavy lifting. At 12,000 feet, System B flickered. Not a failure. A fluctuation. A 3-second dip in pressure that recovered on its own. But 3 seconds at 12,000 feet, with partial hydraulics, was enough to make the flight controls feel like wet rope. Grant froze. His hands were on the yoke, but they weren't moving. His eyes were locked on the pressure gauge, like a man watching a fuse burn. I have the aircraft, Whitney said. She didn't ask. She didn't request. She stated it the way the ground states its position to a falling object. Grant released the yoke. His fingers uncurled, one at a time, slowly, as if each one was giving up a separate argument. Whitney took the controls. Her hands were steady. Her scan pattern was methodical. Airspeed, altitude, heading, hydraulic pressure, repeat. She flew the approach manually. No autopilot, no autothrottle. The airplane did what she told it to, because she told it with precision. And machines respond to precision the way dogs respond to certainty. The runway appeared through the windshield at 800 feet. 34 left. 10,000 feet of concrete. Fire trucks lined up on both sides like a red and white honor guard. Whitney brought the 737 down the glide slope with partial hydraulic authority, compensating for the sluggish controls with small, constant inputs. The technique of a pilot who'd practiced this scenario, not in a simulator once a year, but hundreds of times, because she'd once been the kind of pilot who believed preparation was the only thing standing between a good day and a last day. The main gear touched first, firm but controlled. The nose came down a half-second later. Spoilers deployed. Reverse thrust engaged. The airplane decelerated down the runway, straight, centered, alive. 172 passengers, 6 crew, all of them breathing. In the cabin, someone started clapping. Then more. Then all of them. Grant Wallace sat in the left seat. His hands were in his lap. His face was the color of old paper. For the first time in 22 years, he had no words. Not because he chose silence, but because silence was all that was left. The conference room at Denver International Airport smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee. Gray carpet, gray walls, a long table with 8 chairs and a speakerphone no one had used in years. The kind of room where careers went to get paperwork.
Grant Wallace sat at the far end. He'd already composed himself, jacket straightened, tie retightened, hands folded on the table like a man waiting for a commendation. In his mind, the story had already been written. Captain Grant Wallace, 22-year veteran, safely guided his aircraft through a hydraulic emergency and landed without incident at Denver International. He was already rehearsing the phrasing. The door opened at 4:17 p.m.
4 people entered. 3 men, 1 woman. Dark suits, company IDs clipped to breast pockets. Grant recognized 2 of them, Nathan Price, VP of Operations, and Sandra Kelly, Director of Human Resources. The other 2 were unfamiliar, legal, probably. Legal always looked the same, pressed, expressionless, carrying folders thick enough to break a table. Grant stood, extended his hand to Nathan Price. "Nathan, hell of an afternoon. Happy to walk you through what happened up there."
Price shook his hand, briefly. The kind of handshake that ends a conversation rather than starts one.
"Have a seat, Captain Wallace." The "have a seat" landed wrong. Grant heard it. The tone was off, too flat, too careful, the way people speak when they've rehearsed what comes next. He sat. Price remained standing. He looked at the door. Everyone in the room looked at the door. Whitney Carter walked in.
But not the Whitney Carter that Grant had spent 2 weeks erasing from his cockpit. This Whitney was wearing a charcoal suit, fitted, tailored, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle on a cross-country flight because it cost more than most people's rent. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders, no co-pilot's wings on her chest, no Skyvance lanyard around her neck. She wore a single piece of jewelry, a thin gold chain with a pendant. The pendant was the Skyvance logo. Not the employee version, the founder's version. The one that appeared on the company charter and the original SEC filing, and nowhere else. Grant blinked. His brain registered the change in appearance, but couldn't assign it meaning. Like seeing a familiar word in a foreign alphabet. Nathan Price cleared his throat. "Captain Wallace, I'd like to formally introduce you to Whitney Carter." He paused. The pause was the cruelest part. Founder, majority shareholder, and chairwoman of the board of Skyvance Airlines. The room didn't move. The air didn't move. Grant's face went through a sequence of expressions that lasted about 4 seconds, but contained an entire career's worth of recalculation. Confusion, denial, recognition, and then something that lived below all of those. A cold, spreading understanding that the ground he'd been standing on for 2 weeks had never been ground at all. "That's..." Grant's mouth opened and closed. "That's not possible. She was assigned as a first officer. She had credentials. She had a file." "She has 14,000 flight hours," Price said. "Type-rated on the 737, 757, 767, and the Airbus 320 family. Former military, former chief pilot at Skyvance before she transitioned to ownership 7 years ago. Every credential in her file is real, Captain. All of them." Whitney hadn't spoken yet. She stood at the opposite end of the table, hands at her sides, watching Grant the way a surgeon watches a monitor. Clinical, patient, waiting for the numbers to tell their own story. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the leather notebook. She opened it to the first page. The room went silent in a way that silence doesn't usually go. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. "Day 1, Whitney read. 0642. Pre-flight checklist items 7, 11, and 14 skipped. Copilot's verbal confirmation not requested. CRM non-compliance. She turned the page. Day 1. 0658. Radio transmission overridden during taxi. Deliberate. Page. Day 2. Pre-departure briefing held without Copilot notification. Witnesses, 6 crew members. No objection raised. Page. Day 4. Formal complaint filed citing insufficient CRM skills. Distributed to Chief Pilot, Training Department, and crew scheduling. No supporting evidence attached. No specific incidents cited. She closed the notebook, held it up so Grant could see the cover. Brown leather, worn at the edges, the initials WC embossed in small gold letters. "And this," she said, pulling her phone from her pocket. She pressed play on an audio file. The room's speakers crackled, and then Grant's own voice filled the conference room. Sharp, clear, unmistakable. "Not with her. Get me someone else." The recording played for 11 seconds. Then, silence. Grant's mouth moved. No sound came out. He looked at Price, at Kelly, at the 2 legal officers whose names he still didn't know. Every face in the room had the same expression, the carefully neutral mask of people who had already decided what happened next. I didn't know," Grant said. Whitney tilted her head, just slightly. "Didn't know what, Captain? That I was the owner? Or that what you were doing was wrong?" She let the question sit. She didn't fill the silence. She let it do the work, the way she'd let every silence over the past 2 weeks do the work, absorbing his cruelty like a black box recording a flight that everyone already knew had crashed. "Because if the answer is that you only regret it because of who I turned out to be," Whitney continued, "then you've just told everyone in this room exactly who you are." Grant's hands were flat on the table. His fingers pressed into the surface like he was trying to hold on to something solid. But there was nothing solid left. Sandra Kelly opened her folder. The pages inside were already tabbed with colored flags, yellow for documentation, red for action items. The investigation had started long before this meeting. This meeting wasn't the beginning. It was the closing argument. Whitney placed the notebook on the table. She placed her phone beside it. Evidence and testimony, side by side, quiet as gravestones. Then she turned to Price. "I've seen what I needed to see. Proceed with the formal process." She walked out of the room without looking at Grant again. Her heels clicked against the gray carpet, steady, measured, the same rhythm she'd carried into every cockpit, every briefing room, every moment of humiliation she'd chosen to absorb. The door closed behind her. Grant Wallace sat alone at the end of the table, surrounded by suits and folders, and understood, for the first time, that the woman he'd refused to fly with had been flying the entire airline. The suspension letter arrived in Grant Wallace's inbox at 8 a.m. the following morning. 3 paragraphs. Official Skyvance letterhead. The language was clean, almost surgical. Pending formal investigation. Immediate removal from flight operations. Surrender of company-issued credentials within 24 hours. 22 years reduced to 3 paragraphs. Grant read the letter on his phone, sitting in the Denver Airport Marriott, still wearing yesterday's shirt. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the wall for a long time. The kind of staring that isn't looking at anything, because the thing you're looking at is inside your own head, and you can't turn away from it. Doug Teller and Pete Simmons received their notices the same morning. Theirs were different. Not suspension, but mandatory enrollment in a corrective action program. 12 weeks of anti-discrimination training, behavioral monitoring, and documented performance reviews. The letters made clear that this was not optional, and that the alternative was termination. Doug called Pete. Pete didn't answer. Neither of them called Grant. Gravity works differently when the center collapses. Within 48 hours, Skyvance Airlines issued an internal memo. Not from HR, not from the VP of Operations, but from the office of the chairwoman. Whitney Carter's name at the bottom. Her signature, the same clean strokes that had filled the leather notebook. The memo was 3 pages long. It announced a company-wide restructuring of workplace culture policies effective immediately. The details were specific. Not the vague, "we value diversity" language that companies paste on their websites like wallpaper. Real mechanisms. A new anonymous reporting system, not routed through the same managers who'd ignored complaints for years, but through an independent third-party firm with direct access to the board. Mandatory CRM and anti-bias training for all flight crew twice yearly, with pass requirements tied to scheduling eligibility. A diversity oversight committee with hiring authority, seated by employees elected from each department, not appointed from above. And one more thing. A new mentorship program pairing senior captains with incoming pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. Not mandatory, voluntary. But Whitney understood something about voluntary programs that most executives didn't. When the person offering them is the founder who just walked through fire to prove why they mattered, volunteers show up. Lisa Harmon learned about the restructuring from the memo. She learned about her promotion from a phone call. Whitney called her personally. "Lisa, I want you to know that what you did and what you didn't do during those flights didn't go unnoticed. You were the only crew member who showed basic human decency. I'd like to offer you the role of lead cabin crew supervisor for the Atlanta hub." Lisa sat in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and said nothing for 5 seconds. Then, "I should have said something sooner." "You said something when it mattered," Whitney replied. "That's enough. And now you'll be in a position to make sure the next person doesn't have to wait." Lisa accepted. She hung up and cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes from realizing you've been holding something heavy for a long time, and someone just told you it was okay to put it down.
Grant Wallace cleaned out his locker at the Atlanta crew base on a Thursday afternoon. The hallway was empty. He'd timed it that way, 2:30, when most crews were either in the air or in briefings. He didn't want witnesses. He'd had enough witnesses.
The locker was standard issue. Gray metal, combination lock. Inside, a spare uniform shirt, a headset case, 2 granola bars, and a laminated photo of himself standing next to a 737 on the day he made captain. He was younger in the photo, smiling. The kind of smile that belongs to a person who believes the world is arranged in the correct order, and always will be. He put everything in a cardboard box. The box was small. 22 years fit inside it with room to spare.
As he walked toward the parking lot, he passed the crew bulletin board. A new flyer had been pinned at eye level, the mentorship program announcement. At the top, a photo of Whitney Carter. Not in a co-pilot's uniform, not in a charcoal suit. In a captain's uniform, standing on the tarmac with a 737 behind her, arms crossed, looking directly at the camera.
The woman he'd refused to fly with was looking at him from the bulletin board, and he couldn't look away, and he couldn't look at her either. He walked past. The box under his arm felt heavier than it should have.
Word traveled. The airline industry is smaller than it looks. A network of crew rooms and layover bars and union meetings where stories move faster than weather fronts. Within a month, 3 other regional carriers had contacted Skyvance requesting copies of their new training protocols. 2 national carriers sent observers to the first round of anti-bias workshops.
Whitney didn't give interviews. She didn't release a statement. She let the policy speak and the results accumulate. That was her style. Not the loudest voice in the room, but the one that changed the architecture of the room itself. At the all-hands meeting in Atlanta, 400 employees in the main hangar, folding chairs arranged in rows between parked aircraft, Whitney took the stage. She spoke for 90 seconds. That was all.
Skyvance was built to fly people where they need to go. That mission includes the people who fly the planes. What happened these past 2 weeks should never have been possible. It was possible because we built systems that let it happen. Those systems are gone now. What we build next is up to all of us.
She stepped away from the microphone. 400 people stood up. The applause started at the front row and moved backward like a wave, carrying with it the sound of something breaking open. Not apart, but open. The difference matters.
6 months later, Skyvance Airlines won the Regional Carrier Workplace Excellence Award. The first time a carrier under 200 aircraft had received the honor. The trophy sat in the Atlanta headquarters lobby, next to a framed copy of the anonymous reporting policy and a photograph of the mentorship program's first graduating class. 12 new pilots, 7 women, 4 of them black. All of them smiling like people who'd been told the door was open and found out someone meant it.
Whitney Carter still flew.
Once a month, she'd block out a Tuesday and put herself on the schedule. Not as chairwoman, as a working pilot. First officer on the loop, Atlanta to Charlotte, Charlotte to Jacksonville, Jacksonville back. The same triangle she'd flown during those 2 weeks when she was nobody. She flew it because the cockpit was the only place where the sky didn't care about your title. Because altitude strips things down to what matters: skill, judgment, the ability to stay calm when the instruments disagree with your instincts. And because she wanted every crew member who saw her name on the roster to know that the woman who owned the airline still remembered what it felt like to sit in the right seat and be invisible.
One morning, a 26-year-old first officer named Tara Brooks walked into the briefing room at Hartsfield-Jackson for her first assignment. Tall, nervous, dark skin against a crisp Skyvance uniform that still smelled like packaging. The captain, a 12-year veteran named Steve Alderman, looked up from his coffee. "Brooks, you're my co-pilot today?" Tara straightened. "Yes, sir." Steve stood, extended his hand. "Good to have you. Let's go fly." No hesitation. No second look. No qualifying remark about experience or how things used to be. Just a handshake and a flight plan and 2 pilots about to share a cockpit the way it was always supposed to be shared. Tara shook his hand. Her grip was firm, and somewhere behind her eyes was the knowledge that 6 months ago, this moment might have gone differently. And the reason it didn't was a woman with a leather notebook who'd decided to find out.
As for Grant Wallace, the industry heard pieces. Rumors traveled through layover lobbies and crew scheduling phone trees and the quiet honesty that surfaces between flights when the engines are off.
He'd applied to Coastal Wings, a budget carrier out of Fort Lauderdale running turboprops to island destinations. The kind of airline that 22-year 737 captains don't apply to unless every other door has closed. Coastal Wings reviewed his record, the disciplinary file, the formal findings, the audio recording that had reached more HR departments than Grant could count. They passed. So did the next carrier, and the one after that.
Grant Wallace, 11,000 flight hours, found himself on the ground, not because he couldn't fly, but because no one would let him. The sky had quietly changed the locks. Whitney's leather notebook sat in a glass display case in the executive lobby, a small brass plaque beneath it. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every cockpit deserves respect. New hires learned the story during orientation, not as a cautionary tale, but as a founding principle. The notebook had become a compass.
And on certain Tuesdays, if you flew Skyvance out of Atlanta, you might notice a first officer in the right seat
with a calm that didn't match her rank. She'd run the checklist with quiet precision, handle the radio like someone who'd done this 10,000 times. And when the flight landed, she'd click a pen that was a little too expensive, write 2 lines in a notebook she didn't really need anymore,
And walk off the aircraft without anyone knowing they'd just flown with the woman who owned the airline.
unless they'd heard the story. And these days, most people had. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about someone who's been told they don't belong, drop a comment. Tell us, have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated only to reveal exactly who they were? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe. Hit that bell. Stories like Whitney Carter's don't just happen in cockpits. They happen everywhere. And we'll be here to tell them. Bruh. She sat there for 2 weeks, getting disrespected, humiliated, erased, and she wrote it all down. Not because she was weak, because she was building a case. The owner. The actual owner. Sometimes the person you look down on is the one looking down at you.